Joining us now is Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, a noted public health scientist and assistant professor of epidemiology from Columbia University. Dr. El-Sayed, the first thing that I think a lot of people have on their minds is when you hear about the symptoms of Ebola, it sounds a lot like the flu, at least at first. So what makes Ebola different from viruses that we have come to know here in the West?
Yeah, as you say, Ebola is a very serious virus, and it's very similar to other viruses that we're used to, like the common cold and the flu. But what makes Ebola so dangerous is that it has the added effect of being able to shut down the kidney and the liver and also interrupt the way that the blood works, so that we have this bleeding that happens later on in the infection.
Is there a way that Ebola spreads that is particularly concerning? And by that, I mean, we know about the different ways that the flu spreads, and sometimes that can be very hard to control. We've heard some people describe at least the outbreak in Africa as being uncontrolled right now.
Yeah.
What does that have to do with the way Ebola spreads?
It's important to remember to put Ebola in context. So when we think about the biggest outbreak in history, we're only talking about 1,300 or so patients. That compares to something like the flu, where you're talking about thousands of people who have had the disease. And so when people use the word uncontrollable, it can be very jarring, but we have to, again, put that in context. Uncontrollable within the respect that it's spreading very fast in West Africa. That doesn't mean that we're going to be seeing the types of burdens that we see of something like the flu. The good thing about Ebola also is that it's what we call not very fastidious, meaning something like the flu, you can leave it on a doorknob, somebody else can touch the doorknob and then get the disease. Whereas something like Ebola, you really need to be in close contact with somebody who has the disease, and actually close contact enough for the most part to be able to actually touch some of the bodily fluids. So thankfully it's not as infective as some of the other diseases that we commonly think of when we think of viruses.
Do we know whether Ebola can be transmitted through the air, through a sneeze? They call that an aerosol transmission, I think. What do we know about that?
So there was a paper published in 2012 that showed that, at least between animals, that in theory Ebola could be transmitted in the air. But from what we've observed in terms of outbreaks in the past and in this outbreak, you really need to come in contact with infected bodily fluid to actually contract the disease.
You mentioned that what makes it so deadly is that it can shut down organ systems, including your renal system.
Right.
Without getting too much into the weeds, how does it do that? Why and how is that different from what a virus like the flu is capable of?
Yeah, so this is a virus that infects a lot more cells, a lot more different types of cells than some of the viruses that we're more used to, like the flu or the common cold. And generally, it's through a number of processes, one of which is that it interrupts the way that the blood interacts with itself to do things like clot. And so we get this bleeding, and what happens is you get hemorrhaging, so it means bleeding in internal organs. Also, the way that it interacts with the liver can also cause liver shutdown. And so it's a much more serious virus insofar as it attacks many more parts of the body and can cause some of these really problematic effects.
You are an expert in epidemiology. What are epidemiologists around the world doing right now to take an uncontrollable outbreak or an uncontrolled outbreak and try to contain it?
Yeah, one of the big challenges in sub-Saharan Africa right now is finding people who have been exposed, because there's a real fear of what the treatment will look like. It's scary to be put in quarantine. And so a number of people who might have been exposed are actually hiding from doctors. One of the big goals of epidemiologists is to find people who are exposed and to make sure that they can expose other people if they happen to contract the disease. And so that's really the big effort right now, to try and contain the disease, make sure those who are exposed, who could potentially spread the disease elsewhere, are in treatment, and to try and keep this at least as confined as possible.
As we speak right now, there are preparations being made, discussions being had about bringing 2 Americans who have been infected to the shores of this country. Talk to me about your take on that. Is that the compassionate, right thing to do? Are there risks with doing that?
So these are medical professionals who have really put their lives on the line to take care of people who are ill in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think it's our responsibility to be able to provide them the type of care that they would receive back home. So I think it's responsible to bring them home. Also, if you think about the way that they're going to be brought home, we have a lot of infrastructure on making sure that they are not, that the virus is contained and that they're not exposed to other people who could potentially get the disease. And so I trust the professionals who are thinking through this. I trust that they'll get the best care that they can at the Emory Medical Center, and I think this is the right thing to do.
How prepared do you view the medical apparatus here in this country and here in New York City to deal with the potential of an Ebola case coming to a city like this?
When you think about outbreaks, normally outbreaks are about context, about infrastructure in a particular space. I mean, Sub-Saharan Africa, and West Africa in particular, doesn't have the same type of infrastructure that we have around dealing with an outbreak like this. When people come to attention in a place like the United States or Europe and other high-income societies, generally there's a whole infrastructure, hospital systems around making sure that they receive the best possible care and that they don't expose as many people as possible. Whereas in a situation like West Africa, where, number one, there's a lot of distrust about the medical system, the medical system hasn't been as well endowed as our health system has been, you can see how that might spread in a way that in the United States that's very, very unlikely.
I want to go through right now and give our viewers some of the symptoms of Ebola. We already hear about people being very vigilant in medical settings looking for these kinds of symptoms. The symptoms include fever, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, body aches, which then progress after several days to a rash. And of course, it leads, as you said, to the potential issues with bleeding and the inability to clot and potential of liver failure. I want to touch, at least for a moment, on what the potential would be if we began to see a city like this with so many people having so many interactions a day. I mean, we're a very densely populated city. Are there bigger risks here than elsewhere?
In theory, there are bigger risks. That being said, we have to put this in the context of Ebola being a not very fastidious virus like we talked about earlier. And so the likelihood of just walking by somebody in the street, which we happen to do all the time in New York City, and getting the disease because they might be coming down with it is really, really unlikely. Second, generally, almost anybody who's going to come down with Ebola is going to have had a travel history to a place in West Africa. And given that travel history, we can generally rely on people to wanting to get the best care that they can. So the likelihood of them just walking around in the setting of having these symptoms, in the setting of being able to spread it, is very, very unlikely.
And before I let you go, where's the research heading? Do we have a vaccine? Are we working toward a vaccine?
Unfortunately, there are really two challenges to promoting a vaccine. The first is that the research really hasn't been there. And like we talked about, this is the biggest outbreak in history, and it only affects 1,300 people. So we really rely on pharmaceutical companies to take this research forward, but there's very, very little incentive given that, number one, there are very few patients who have the disease, and number two, most of them are really poor. That being said, the NIH has recently fast-tracked moving a vaccine that's available for macaque monkeys and testing it in humans, hopefully to be ready by early 2015.
Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, thank you very much for coming, expert on epidemiology. I'm sure that your expertise is very much in demand. A lot of curiosity about this these days.
Thank you for having me.
All right.